Welcome to Hungary, Mr. Abbott, once again, Mr. Prime Minister. How's that in Australia? It's the Prime Minister is the official title is the honourable, right? And you keep the title.
You keep being known as the honourable, whether you are or not. You keep that title, but in America, once a president, always a president. I'm afraid in Australia, once a Prime Minister, ever after a former Prime Minister.
Right, right. So how, it's the second time you're here.
This is the third time I've been here for the Danube Institute. I came in...
So you're coming home, practically.
Well, not quite, but certainly a place that I've really enjoyed, and I hope that I'm here again often. The Danube Institute has become quite an interesting and vital think tank, and this conference that I'm participating in right now has attracted some very, very interesting people from quite a lot of different countries. And yeah, Budapest is quite the intellectual centre of Middle Europe at the moment.
Very happy to hear that. Let me add a little bit of a personal touch in there too. I've been fortunate enough to travel the world a lot, been to about 60 countries, and I love them all, honestly. But I would never think of living in any one of them by choice, because Hungary is my country and I love it here.
No, I get that.
The only country that I've been to where I had this kind of well, this is a place if I were forced to, but that I could actually live here, and that was Australia.
Well, thank you, Yolt, for saying that.
And I'm just trying to get the interview, you know,
no.
start on the right foot.
I hear you.
Serious.
But look, a lot of Hungarians have moved to Australia over the years, particularly after 1956. We had a big influx of Hungarians for obvious reasons. But I think there are few people who visit Australia and don't feel in the course of that visit that this is a place where they could stay, because Australia is the ultimate immigrant society, other than the...
More so than the US, even?
More so than the US, because well, our history is shorter. I mean, the settled history of the United States goes back to the early 1600s. Ours goes back to 1788. In fact, in 1820, there were still probably only about 20,000 European people in Australia. So in the last 200 years, we've gone from 20,000 European people to 25 million people, still mostly of European descent. But we are the world's global village. And there are people from almost every country and every culture who have come to Australia over the last 200 years. Nearly all of them have made a wonderful success of their life in Australia. I don't think there's any country which is more welcoming of newcomers. Yes, we want people to join Team Australia, but we expect them to do it in their own way and at their own time. And I think that's one of the magical qualities of modern Australia. It is, in a sense, the global village in one country. And yet we all do have a strong sense of being Australian, and I think a strong sense of gratitude.
And you also have a strong immigration policy too. And just to continue along those lines, when I was praising Australia, to cuddle up even more, when you were airing an ad on television, which had you in the ad actually saying to the immigrants, you will not come to Australia on those boats. I can't exactly quote how the ad actually went, but it was a very strong message that you are not going to come to Australia illegally. And that's a very important thing. But I had an experience. Actually, I think it was in New Zealand actually, but I had similar in Australia too, where I saw people from all over the world, you know, restaurants from this part, that part. It was all multicultural, yet, although the young kids, they were crossing the street as this class, they were all speaking English perfectly. There was, you know, there were Malaysians, there were blacks, there were Chinese. You could tell that it's a totally mixed lot. They were all Australians. You have managed to do what Europe is totally unable to do, is integrate those immigrants, welcome them legally. Is that still a success story in Australia? You think it's still working?
We do the melting pot very well in Australia, arguably even better than the United States. That said, we do expect people to join Team Australia. That doesn't mean that they forget their heritage, doesn't mean that they can't occasionally feel nostalgia for their original home. But there is this expectation that you join Team Australia, you respect Australian values, you obey Australian law, you look with kindness and benevolence on your neighbours.
You don't develop parallel societies in cities.
No. And again, there are no banlieues, if I pronounce the French term properly, in Australian cities. There are no no-go zones in Australian cities.
What's the secret of the success?
Well,
that strict standpoint, what you actually represented in those ads?
Well, certainly the reason why Australians are overwhelmingly welcoming of migrants is because we have a migration program that the Australian government runs. It's not, we don't subcontract it out to people smugglers. And if there ever was a situation where the people smugglers were running our immigration program, as for a time there appeared to be a few years back, well, there is a corresponding dip in public support for immigration. But essentially, we've always been a society of newcomers. Ever since 1788, we've been a society of newcomers. And I think that disposes us to be naturally welcoming and naturally outgoing towards the stranger in our midst, because a generation or two back, we were strangers too.
I always get this kind of feeling about Australia as one of the last remaining islands, and in this case, islands actually literal, not just symbolic, remaining islands of sanity in the Western world, where we cannot just close our eyes and pretend the immigration is not happening, of course. But Australia is managing to keep it in check, and not just to keep it in check physically, but the mentality of the population. People understand why it's important to have some sort of a limit, some sort of checkpoints and so on. And also, if we look at the bigger picture, I've seen Australia as the last bastion of hope against wokeness, against cultural Marxism. But apparently the last couple of years, I guess, I don't know, I'm starting to, I'm not saying hope is fading, but I'm seeing some things in Australia that I'm not sure I'm happy about. One of them is actually the totally, and I think unnecessarily harsh response against people who were protesting the COVID lockdowns.
And you're right to be dismayed by the virtual health dictatorship that Australia became for a while. I mean, older people in Hungary know what a dictatorship is like, and they know just how wrong it is to treat people brutally for daring to speak their mind. Well, I'm afraid in Victoria in particular, there was a remarkably, horribly oppressive police response, a grotesque official overreaction to people who were making the point that normal life should not have been stopped just because of a virus, which by that stage we well and truly knew was not nearly as serious, as we initially feared. So look, Yolt, you're right. Australia is a great country. It always has been, and I'm confident it always will. But that doesn't mean that we are as good as we should be. And I'm afraid the woke disease, which has afflicted so much of the Western world, particularly the English-speaking world, is no less rampant in Australia than elsewhere. I mean, when I look at the climate cult, when I look at this gender fluidity push, the virus hysteria we've just mentioned, the magic pudding economics, but worst of all,
the free lunch.
Worst of all, the cultural self-loathing. We have it in Australia too. I mean, no country on earth is more welcoming of migrants. No country on earth is fairer to minorities than Australia. And yet
And yet there is self-loathing.
And yet, if you go into an Australian university, you will find plenty of academics who think we're the worst place on earth. Now, none of those academics would change places with university teachers in Iran or Beijing, but nevertheless, they still say we're the worst country on earth.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Australian politics for those who are really interested in the in the spices.
In the minutiae.
Yeah, exactly. For some reason, the Anglo-Saxon world seems to be running with two-party systems, whether it's the US, the UK. Although in the UK there's a third party, the Liberals, who are kind of sometimes a little bit stronger, but in general it's a two-party system. So is Canada, and so is Australia, as opposed to traditional European democracies, which are like multi-party systems. If you look at Italy, they can never form a government. This is like the first government, the real government they're having in decades.
Sure. Yeah.
Because what do you think is the reason for that? Is that the Anglo-Saxon world seems to like the binary system, where it's this or that, yes or no, red or blue?
Well, there's a long tradition of parliamentary democracy starting in Westminster, and on any one, and the way a parliamentary democracy works is that ministers present bills to the Parliament, and it's either yes or no, essentially. In the end, it's yes or no. So when you've got a binary choice on bills, over time, what tends to evolve is a binary choice on the attitudes and values and broad philosophies which motivate those bills. So I just think that it's something which is deeply embedded in our culture.
Common sense, I guess, that at the end of the day, you need to vote yes or no. And when you're voting yes, it's pointless to vote yes from so many different standpoints or vote no from so many different standpoints. You got to, put your money where your mouth is.
And if in the end your political success depends upon harvesting a parliamentary majority, well, you've got to build alliances, and the best alliance is one where you're all in the same party, or there are parties which are so closely cohering,
like the German Christian Democrats and the Free Democrats used to be.
Or in Australia, the Liberal Party and the National Party, for instance, or in Britain, I think it was the Conservative and Unionist parties, for instance. I think that's still the formal title of the Conservative Party in Britain. So I think there's just a natural tendency which has been reinforced by history in the English-speaking countries to form two broad voting blocs.
It's a more pragmatic approach, I guess. If you want to get things done, you need to have strong parties, whether it's this party or that, to get your views, get your programs across. As opposed to, like, as we can see in many European countries, it's the struggle to form a government and then to implement the policies, because there's so many parties with so many different attitudes, different agendas.
Yeah, look, I'm not an expert on the politics of Europe, I've got to say. I mean, I've watched them, and I guess you draw some conclusions, but I don't claim to have studied them deeply. But governance in Britain was kind of a bottom-up thing, whereas I think in continental Europe it's been more of a top-down thing. And even in Anglo-Saxon times, there was a strong tradition of local democracy. And yes, there were kings, but the British monarch has never been an absolute ruler in the way that so many of the European monarchs were. So look, it's a cultural thing, it's a traditional thing, but I do think also it's a practical thing. And while I would be the last to say that everything is perfect in the English-speaking world right now, even in Australia, I still think that there are lots and lots of deep strengths in our particular culture and in our version of Western civilization, which I think help to explain why the English-speaking countries have often been looked to for inspiration by others.
So much so that, for example, Japan has actually, it's not a traditional democracy, not at all, but it has, I guess, adopted the more or less the American way of politics, of democracy or constitutional republic, which the United States actually is.
Well, I'd say that Japan is probably more reminiscent of the British democracy in that they've got a monarch, the emperor,
True.
And they've got a prime minister who is responsible to the parliament as opposed to directly elected by the people, or more or less directly elected by the people through the electoral college.
And the reason I actually brought Japan into the picture is it's funny how in Japan, even though it's a two-party system, one party has been dominant since World War II. I think the equivalent of the Labour Party came into power twice during the 70 or so years that has passed since then. And the conservative, the actual conservative party in Japan is called Liberal.
Yes.
Whereas in Canada, which I've mentioned before, there's the Conservative and the Liberal Party, which is the opposition. In the UK, the Conservative and Labour Party, with Liberals somewhere in the middle, but not so. In Australia, the Liberal Nationals, like in Japan, are on the right, on the Conservative side, and there's Labour on the left. Is it because Australia, that the Liberal Party is actually on the right? Is it because Australia is more liberal in nature, a little more to the centre, is more left in Australia? I think not.
No. Look, the term liberal, even in Britain, it became an equivocal word in the course of the 19th century. I mean, the liberals of the first half of the 19th century were very much about freedom, but the liberals of the second half of the 19th century started to become more about opportunity, and instead of leaving the people alone, the state was there to facilitate more equality and so on. So I think this is where the term liberal went off in two different directions, and you can make a case for both types of liberalism, if you like, but I'm certainly a liberal of the on liberty time in Mill's life, not a liberal in the later Millian tradition, because as Mill got older, he became a virtual communist.
Right. That's what the liberals of today are doing. So the Australian liberals and the Japanese liberals are actually first half of 20th century type of liberals, believing in individual freedom, in the right of the people to live their own lives, left alone by the state. Whereas the Canadian liberals are the total opposite.
Exactly right. The state's got to hold your hand through every period of your life.
And if you don't do what the state said,
the state gives you a yank. It yanks your hand to get you back onto the right path.
You're better off if they just yank you and not something worse. One more last question before our time is up. Just again a little bit of a personal, but on your side, did you think Malcolm Turnbull or Kevin Rudd was more of your adversary at the time?
Well, look, both of them are now, as I am, members of that distinguished club and exclusive club of ex-Prime Ministers, and I'm not really in the business of being critical of members of the club. Look, both Malcolm and Kevin had strengths and weaknesses. Kevin,
but I mean, which one of them did you consider more of your rival?
Kevin,
for obvious reasons.
Kevin was my opponent across the chamber. Malcolm was, I suppose, my competitor inside the Liberal Party. And look, if you're a Liberal, you believe in competition. A bit of competition isn't a bad thing, but I'm just going to leave other people and ultimately history to judge all those things.
Very diplomatic, very professional answer. Just what we would expect from Australia's former Prime Minister. And of course, I will not ask you about Mr. Albanese because you would probably be just as diplomatic. Thank you very much.
We wish him well. It's important for our country that the Prime Minister, whoever he or she might be, whatever party he or she might represent, it's important for our country that the Prime Minister of the day succeed.
Thank you very much. That should be a very good and strong message for Hungarians. Thank you.
Good on you.